professor in my chair,
That's
the one who pushed me here today. We have Dr. David from Cal State Hill, another brilliant professor, and Dr. Bob Paul, who is the most brilliant ethics professor in the world. Does that help? We have in the back my husband, my living husband on the camera, and then you've seen the two little children running around. That's Ariel and Justin. And I'm so happy everybody else is with me today. So I think I'm going to start. Okay. All right. I'd like to welcome you for joining me. Thank you for joining me on this very special day where we're going to be talking about a topic that I fell in love with a few years ago. But before I go into it, I wanted to share some of the passion behind my research. I grew up in a relatively disadvantaged household. Experienced social problems, economic problems, domestic problems, a real cesspool of life. And in my environment, I witnessed that people did what they had to do to get by. That even good people, kind people, even they ended up having to make a wrong decision every once in a while. And at night, I would have a conversation with these people in my head, and I would say to them, there's some thing happening within you, and that thing caused you to make a bad decision today. And the funny thing about this thing is that it impacted people in different ways. That would mean people or bad people, when the opportunity presented itself, they actually ended up making the right decision. And so this thing that drives and moves people to do both good and bad is what I present to you today. But instead of calling it that thing, I'll call it ethical reasoning. And the title of this dissertation is Nurturing the Ethical Reasoning of Leaders, the Illumination of Ethics Education, Demographics, and Teaching Methods. Let me introduce you with a quote that goes like this. It's often said that a picture can paint 1,000 words. But I always wondered if the opposite could happen. Can a word speak 1,000 pictures? When, for example, somebody says the word crime, images that might come to mind are a petty liquor store theft or a gruesome murder scene in the forest. When somebody says the word technology, the images that might come to mind are a supercomputer, a cloned human being, or maybe even a telephone. So what kind of images come to mind when the word Enron is spoken? When I think of Enron, I think of men in expensive business suits making secret phone calls, pouring monstrous amounts of money into secret bank accounts. But perhaps in the world of education, the images that are spoken by the word Enron are sleeping accounting students during an ethics class, images of dilapidated books incapable of communicating ethical codes of conduct, or maybe images of a chronologically matured professor reading from his weathered old notes that he wrote so long ago.
Easy.
Carry on. So this is the environment that intrigues me, ethics education, the learning and teaching activities within. And to give you a background, education in general seeks to teach knowledge and skills. And when it comes to problems, it is skills that can help you maneuver through those problems to come to a resolution. And in the literature, one particular set of skills can enable you to make a decision in a moral dilemma known as ethical reasoning skills, which are said can be measured through an instrument known as the defining issues test. From those processes, I've identified a few gaps from which emerged the study. First of them being that it seems that there is an increase in the quantity of ethics education being offered, but not necessarily in the quality being offered. Also, there seems to be quite an increase in the amount of effort going into teaching ethics, but not necessarily assessment that goes into the learning of ethics. And finally, there's this idea that you teach ethics for a reason. That you don't teach ethics just because it's cool to teach. You teach that ethics has goals. And there is little evidence that these goals are being met. And so from those problems emerged my three purposes. The first of them being to determine if there are changes in ethical reasoning after exposure to an ethics class. And to see if one's demographics, what they're born with, has an impact in developing their ethical reasoning. And finally, to determine whether, or despite whether it's a teacher, a minister, or a parent, does the way in which you deliver ethics have an impact in your ethical reasoning? From those arose my three research questions, the first one being, is there a difference in the change in the ethical reasoning of those who were exposed versus not exposed to a core ethics course. My second research question is there a relationship between an individual's demographics and their ethical reasoning levels? And finally, is there an impact or a difference in ethical reasoning based on different teaching methods employed? And before we move on, I wanted to go over a couple of definitions so that we're all singing from the same sheet of music. First of them being, when we speak about principles, we're talking about guidelines for behavior. Values are preferences for various principles and values and morals deal with good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil. The DIT is the instrument I'll be using to measure ethical reasoning. It produces a P-score, which is the percentage of the time that individuals engage in post-conventional higher levels of ethical reasoning. Ethical reasoning is the cognitive part within you, the thinking part that responds to a moral dilemma. And a moral dilemma, by definition, is a conflict between two opposing values. So I had to look at what existing studies had to say about the things that I was looking at. The title of this dissertation is Nurturing the Ethical Reasoning of Leaders, the Illumination of Ethics Education, Demographics, and Teaching Methods. Beginning first with ethical reasoning. To begin to describe what ethical reasoning is, I present the four-component model developed by James West, who was also the person that developed the DIT. And he said that when you're faced with a moral dilemma, there are many processes working within you to respond to that moral dilemma. The first one being that you're made aware that a situation exists, that you're sensitive to it. And after identifying that a situation exists, you think about it. There's this cognitive portion within you that judges right from wrong. So you identify a situation, you think about it, then there's this motivational component within you. That's a persistence to follow through with a decision made at the reasoning level. And finally, there's this behavioral component. So the idea is that you identify that a situation exists, you think about it, then you muster up enough strength to go ahead and do something about it. Ethical reasoning is a component we'll be focusing on in this study. And it's based in moral development theory, which begins with a man by the name of John Piaget, who said that people learn in stages. And when it comes to ethics, a theorist named Lawrence Kohlberg said that there are 6 stages, which we'll go over in a second. And James West said that progression through these stages can be measured using the DIT. Going back to Lawrence Kohlberg, he said that similar to K through 12 education, individuals learn ethics incrementally in one of 6 stages. That at stage 1, people learn to make decisions to avoid punishment. At stage 3, people learn to make decisions to please others. And at stage 6, people learn to make decisions neither to avoid punishment for themselves, neither to please others, but just because it's the right thing to do, for the principle of it all. These stages are clumped into 3 overall levels of moral development: pre-conventional, conventional, where most people are said to be, and post-conventional. And this study is based on this model and on the DIT, which is also based on this model. So this is how we'll be measuring ethical reasoning. When it comes to ethics education, it's said that the higher education an individual obtains, the higher their levels of ethical reasoning is likely to be. And when we talk about learning, we're going to talk about it in terms of praxis. And there are many different learning styles. One particular model of learning styles is presented by a theorist named Hunter Lewis, so that people learn ethics, particularly values, in one of 4 ways. They can learn ethics by touching it, seeing it, or hearing it, but they can learn ethics by logically thinking about it. That they can reason A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. They can also learn by feeling something, by letting their emotions take a hold of them. And they can also learn ethics not by experiencing it, but just by coming to them through intuition. You can, for example, wake up one day and realize that something is just the right thing to do. So what these different learning styles tell me is that there's a variety of ways in which information is filtered before it gets into an individual. When it comes to teaching, there are 4 general approaches that are employed. The first one of them is teaching by thinking, stimulating contemplate about ethical issues. Then there's teaching by doing, having students perform an action and then contemplate about that action. Then there's teaching by believing, instilling into individuals socially desired values. And then there's finally teaching by being, having students clarify their existing values, so for example, by imposing their own code of conduct. And what these different teaching methods tell me is that there's a variety of ways in which ethics is delivered. And how it relates to learning is that not only are there a variety of ways in which ethics are taught, but there are a variety of ways in which ethics are received. There is this kind of labyrinth between teaching and learning that information has to go through. This study is interested in the teaching of ethics, the pathway of a moral development teaching approach through a deductive logic learning style. So teaching and learning ethics through thinking. The literature and demographics suggest that with increase of age, there should be increases of ethical reasoning. It also indicates that men and women should differ in their ethical reasoning levels, that different ethnic groups should also differ, as well as different employment sectors, so nonprofit versus profit versus governmental institutions. And that with increases of work experiences that people have, there should also be increases of ethical reasoning. So based on that literature review, I was able to figure out what happened to my presentation and see your understanding as I turn on the computer.
Got a juice?
Pretend I don't remember. I think so. Can you guys notice?
Give it on the voice.
Okay. Okay, so pretend you didn't notice that.
You can edit it out.
Edit it out of the video. So based on my going back, how does this all relate to the leader? Well, the impact of leaders upon ethics is noted in organizational theory, which states that leaders play a hand in shaping an organization's culture, and one component of that culture is ethics. And likewise, ethics shapes back the behavior of a leader. So based on that literature review, I was able to come up with 3 hypotheses for my research question. That my first hypothesis was, after exposure to an ethics class, there should be an increase in ethical reasoning. And that with increases in age, I hypothesized there should be increases in ethical reasoning, that male and females should differ in their ethical reasoning, as well as different ethnic groups, and different individuals from different employment sectors. I also hypothesized that with increases of work experience, there should be increases of ethical reasoning. And that I also hypothesized that different teaching methods result in different levels of ethical reasoning. So value clarification, value transmission, and moral development would result in different levels. The characteristics I studied is ethical reasoning as defined by the DIT, exposure to an ethics class, demographic characteristics of age, gender, ethnicity, employment sector, and the teaching methods of value transmission, value clarification, and moral development. I collected the data myself by coordinating first with faculty. Then I administered the instrument during class time to about 105 students. They identified themselves anonymously using a 4-digit ID. I entered the information into a database and scored it using a manual from the DIT. Checked my math against random test scores sent to the University of Minnesota. They matched, and I was able to analyze the data using both descriptive and inferential statistics. The DIT looks like this. It comes with 3 moral dilemmas. And after reading each moral dilemma, students are to go to an answer sheet where they identify who they are and they make a decision. And then they rate 12 items in terms of their importance of whether they contributed to their decision. And finally, perhaps most important, they identify the 4 most important items that contributed to their decision. And this produces a P-score that for different groups are said to differ, that junior high students should be in the 20s, and graduate students like the one in the study should be in their 50s. and that there are also different thresholds for what's considered pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional levels. The instrument has high validity. It's been used thousands of times around the world since the 1970s. It has high reliability, checks for consistency and social desirability, and it's easy to use in a group setting. It can be accomplished in 15 minutes. The participants who ended up being involved were between 30 to 40, mostly male, ethnically identified as being white, were mostly working for profit organizations and had quite a bit of work experience. About 53% had at least 16 years or more of work experience. There was a good distribution of scores. Most of the scores, as expected, fell within the conventional levels. The lowest score was 10.0, the highest score was 82.5. The average P-score for the participants in my study was 40.5, which is lower than the average P-score of graduates in other studies, which is 53.5. When I looked at the results for the first research question, I noticed that before exposure to the ethics class, there was an average P-score of 41.4. And after exposure, there was an average P-score of 39.0. This is also presented in my table, which also shows a comparison group. The scores didn't change, and the comparison group did not get exposed to an ethics class. It's represented visually here, where you can see a slight decrease. However, there were no significant differences between those who exposed and those who were not exposed to the core ethics class. When it came to age, it seemed that there were slight increases with increases in age. However, statistically, these differences were not significant. When it came to gender, it seemed that women were higher on average in their ethical reasoning, but these differences were not significant based on statistics. And also for different ethnic groups, it seemed that Latinos scored higher, but these differences were not significant. And also for different employment sectors, it seemed that nonprofit individuals scored higher on average, but these differences were not significant statistically. And then finally, with increases of work experience, there was no pattern, and at the same time, even if there were, these differences were not statistically significant. But when it came to teaching methods, there were three teaching methods employed, and two of the three resulted in decreases, while one of them resulted in an increase. So moral development and value transmission methods resulted in a decrease, while value clarification methods, which is teaching by being, resulted in an increase. And these differences were statistically significant. I looked at other things. So for example, before exposure to an ethics course, most of the individuals were at post-conventional levels, about 44%, and after exposure, most of the individuals were at conventional levels, 38%. Over time, the effects of the teaching methods tended to diminish. So while during the 3-month educational intervention, the teaching methods resulted in a decrease, but a year later, the students tended to go back to the levels that they were at before exposure to the ethics class. And I also looked at another demographic characteristic called religious activity, and it seemed that those who infrequently attended to religious activities tended to have higher on average ethical reasoning scores, while those who attended most frequently tended to have lower average scores. Just like the other demographic characteristics, these differences were not significant. In general, there was support for only one of the three hypotheses that I had, that although there was a decrease in ethical reasoning after exposure to the course, and most of the individuals turned into, actually a majority of the individuals were at conventional levels, there was no significant difference between those who took the course and those who did not take the course. And that with age, gender, ethnicity, employment sector, work experience, and religious activity, it seemed that there were differences, but these differences were not significant. But when it came to teaching methods, these methods were significantly different, and that over time they tended to diminish, perhaps because there was little reinforcement of the information in the course. What can I say? I'm very limited in my conclusions regarding ethics education. I'm not able to say that there is a major impact in general. Perhaps the way in which the information was delivered might have resulted in a decrease. And perhaps the class was not conducive to ethical reasoning, maybe conducive to other aspects of morality like character or behavior, but that wasn't picked up by this study. And the decrease in ethical reasoning after exposure is very interesting because it suggests that people can change and shift back to their original thinking, that progression is not linear, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 model that goes by over. So that's very interesting. When it comes to teaching methods, I can say that the way in which ethics is delivered has a significant impact, regardless of who delivers them, and that not all methods are the same. So, for example, value clarification methods tend to increase ethical reasoning, while value transmission and moral development methods tend to decrease ethical reasoning. And these effects tend to diminish over time. And the variation in teaching and its effect on ethical reasoning is indicative of the variation in learning, which is spoken to earlier in my model that showed that there's a variety of ways in which ethics is taught and learned. Not all pathways are equally the same or as strong. The study, of course, my conclusions are based on the results, ethics education, demographics being non-significant while teaching methods were significant. And what this tells me is that it's not really about what you teach or who you teach to, it's about how you teach that will have a significant impact upon the ethical reasoning of others. Of course, my study is limited by a variety of factors. First, that there were only 100 students involved, that they came from a small private college in Southern California, that the quasi-experimental nature of my study restricts it from being generalizable to other populations, that leadership students were used for the first time, whereas in most other studies, there were business, medical, or law students involved. And finally, also that development over time, those conclusions based on development over time, is limited by the tendency of individuals to drop off of participation. And finally, the study is limited because it's based on Kohlberg's model, which, again, the highest level was this justice, fairness orientation, and it's also suggested that ethical development is logical. But ethical development may not always be logical, that there may have been changes in character and behavior that happened in individuals after exposure to the course, but those changes weren't picked up by the model, by the instrument, and by the study. Future studies should look at other aspects of morality. So for example, how a person perceives that they're going to act and how they actually perform would be of interest, as well as longitudinal changes over a period of many years. It's also interesting to identify what are the teacher characteristics, books, or ethical cases that can be examined that would enhance ethical reasoning. And finally, I'd like to see studies that look into what a person believes versus how they actually behave. Ethical reasoning manifests in a variety of our experiences, and these experiences can both limit or expand ethical reasoning. Certainly there's more to ethics than the simple orchestra of classes, accident of birth, and progression of time. That a variety of factors impact ethical reasoning. There's something noteworthy about the society we live in, and its powerful role in shaping who we are. Ethics isn't something that can be put in a glass box for others to see. Something that has to be felt and thought about and experienced. It's breathtaking to imagine how ethical reasoning develops within us, but what is more amazing, perhaps, is this tendency of humans to bump into one another in this crowded room that we call life, and that through bumping, people exercise some form of moral judgment. What is hoped is that learning curves, that daily and ever so slowly, there is a greater understanding of how people work together through ethical issues. The more that is learned about the development of ethics within each of us, the more remarkable we become. I'd like to say thank you for joining me on this special day and for sharing with me my passion. Really, that is to understand people. Not to understand rocks or abstract formulas that you can't see, but to understand people. And hopefully, in this journey, you've learned to appreciate, just as I have, not only the ethics of others, but the ethics of yourself, with the realization that ethics are nurtured, and in addition to being learned, ethics are changeable, and the good versions of it are definitely sustainable. This concludes my presentation. I invite you to share in a dialogue about how I can better my research from here.